Okay, well, we'll begin. Thanks everyone for coming. This is the Wednesday afternoon discussion at the Steele Center, and today we are very grateful that Dr. Brian Van Norden is here to share his research with us. So welcome everybody online who's joining us. Welcome everyone in person. I'll give a full introduction to Dr. Brian Van Norden tomorrow night. But for today, he's the James Monroe Taylor Chair in Philosophy at Vassar College. Spent his life researching Chinese philosophy, and will today be talking about Like Loving a Lovely Sight, Knowledge and Action in Chinese Philosophy. So we're grateful you're here to share your research with us. Let's give him a warm welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Everybody's been very kind to me since I've been here, and thank you to those of you who are joining us via Zoom. So the text I'm going to be talking about today is a passage in the Great Learning, which is one of the classics of the Confucian tradition. And traditionally, the Great Learning is said to consist of an opening statement by Confucius himself, or Kunze, as he's known in Chinese, with a commentary on it by his immediate disciple, Zhuangzi, Master Zhang. And I'd like to, and this is my picture here is a display of the opening classic section in some beautiful calligraphy. The particular passage I want to focus on is part of the commentary section attributed to Master Zhang, which explains what Confucius means in the main classic section. And there we find this enigmatic passage. What is meant by making thoughts have sincerity is to let there be no self-deception. It's like hating a hateful odor or loving a lovely sight. This is called not being conflicted. And one of the things we often find in traditions is passages in classic texts that are a little bit obscure, and then these often become the locus of animated discussions in the commentarial tradition as people tease out the meaning and argue about what the philosophical significance is of that meaning. So we're going to see how this happens with this passage. The first question that occurs to, I think, anybody looking at this passage is, what should we hate like we hate a hateful odor? What should we love like we love a lovely sight? Because the passage just says, well, it's like this, but what's like that? The classic commentator Zhu Xi, whose interpretation of the classics became orthodoxy, he lived in the 12th century, so he's actually not that far in time from Thomas Aquinas, who plays a kind of similar role in synthesizing ideas in the Western tradition. And Zhu Xi, whose interpretation became orthodox, explains, this verse means that those who desire to cultivate themselves must make their hatred of evil be like their hating a hateful odor, and their love of the good be like their loving a lovely sight. Now, part of this, I think, is pretty clear. So you should hate evil like you hate a hateful odor, a bad smell. What does that mean? Another commentator, Wang Yangming, explains smelling a hateful odor, a bad odor, is a case of knowing, while hating a hateful odor is a case of acting. As soon as one smells that hateful odor, one naturally hates it. It's not as if you first smell it and only then, intentionally, you decide to hate it. So what this means is, in the case of a bad smell, when you recognize the bad smell, you're like, oh, that's disgusting, that's gross. A lot of you guys live in dorms, and so maybe you had the experience of like a shared refrigerator, and you're like, I wonder if this half and half or this cream is still good. And you take it out of the refrigerator, and you smell like, oh no, that is not good. That is not good at all. Now, when you realize the half and half or the cream's gone bad, you don't sit there like, oh, that's gone bad. Maybe I should put this in my coffee. You know what? Maybe I'll just put it on my cereal this morning. No, you're like, it's disgusting. Get it away from me. So your hatred of evil should be like that. When you recognize it's evil, you should be repulsed by it so you don't have a second thought about possibly doing the evil thing. So in the case of hating evil, your perception of it as evil and your motivation to avoid it should be unified, like your perception of a disgusting odor as disgusting, and your repulsion, your desire to get away from it, are unified. That part makes sense. But the other part always puzzled me when I first started learning Chinese. Now, I know most of us don't know Chinese, but here's the Chinese of the full passage, or at least the bit like hating a hateful odor, like loving a lovely, whatever it is, sight. The hateful odor part I got pretty early on. I'm like, okay, I get that. You should hate evil like you hate a disgusting odor. You recognize it's evil. You hate it. You want to get away from it. What does like loving a lovely sight mean? One influential translator is Wing-Sit Chan, and for a long time his source book of Chinese philosophy was the go-to book if you wanted to learn Chinese thought. And he renders the second half of this line like loving a beautiful color. James Legge, a Victorian Presbyterian missionary who translated all the Chinese classics, renders this love what is beautiful. Johnson and Ping, who did a recent new translation of The Great Learning and the Mean, which if you're really interested in these texts, I really recommend it because they give translations of the original texts and two different Chinese commentaries translations, so you can see how the work was interpreted differently in history. They give Loving a Beautiful Sight, and then Tewald and Van Norden, in their recent translation, give Loving a Lovely Sight. But what does that mean? Well, the thing that always puzzled me is that hating a bad odor and loving a beautiful color, if that's what it means, don't seem like mirror images of each other. So is the idea that, oh, you should hate evil like you hate a disgusting odor, and you should love the good like you love a pretty color. What would it even mean to love a beautiful color? I mean, I just imagine somebody showing me their bathroom that they just painted and like, isn't this a lovely shade of blue that I painted the bathroom? Yeah, it is. Like, that's how I'm supposed to love the good? Like, ooh, what a nice shade of blue. They just don't seem like parallel cases. And it took me a long time to figure this out, and then here's actually some cutting-edge scholarship. I finally stumbled across the answer. And on this, as on many topics, our friend Zhu Xi, the great synthesizer of Confucian thought, had figured it out and explained it a long time ago. It just took me a while to realize what he was doing in his commentary. There's a famous passage in the Analects, the sayings of Confucius, where Confucius says, I've yet to meet someone who loves virtue as much as he loves physical beauty. Right? And the term he uses here is sa. That's the same term in Chinese that we're rendering loving a lovely sight. And in his commentary in this Analects passage, Zhu Xi says, loving a lovely sight and hating a hateful odor are sincerity. Loving virtue like one loves physical beauty, this is to sincerely love virtue. However, people are seldom able to do this. And if you're still not sure what's going on, in other words, you're supposed to love the good not like you love a beautiful shade of blue or whatever. And it's also not, as James Legge's translation suggests, like loving a beautiful work of art or loving some great aesthetic beauty. Rather, what it is loving someone or something that you find erotically attractive. So it's like the earlier Platonic notion of erotic attraction. And this is a classic painting, Bronzino's, Folly, Cupid, and Time, which some people have described as the most erotic classical work of art there is. So, hating evil like hating a hateful odor, and loving goodness like loving a lovely sight means your ethical perception and motivation are, or at least they should be, inseparable. When we hate a bad odor or an evil thing, our perception of it as foul or evil should be inseparable from our revulsion, which motivates us to avoid it. But if you think about attraction, erotic attraction to somebody, if you define someone erotically attractive is to be drawn toward them. So when we love a lovely sight or love the good, our perception of it as appealing or good is, or at least should be, inseparable from our attraction, which motivates us to pursue it. Now, why is that so important? It's important because it relates to the issue of the connection between ethical knowledge and ethical action. There's a famous story that all the later Confucians know, and it was told by the great Confucian Cheng Yi. He said, genuine knowledge is different from common knowledge. I once met a farmer who'd been mauled by a tiger. I'm glad you enjoyed that. It took me a long time to actually figure out how to get a tiger growl into my PowerPoint. So
That's the sound of a mauling.
that was the sound of a mauling. Yeah, that's a guy being mauled by a tiger. And so Chung-Yi continues, someone reported that a tiger had just mauled someone in the area, and everyone present expressed alarm. But the countenance and behavior of the farmer was different from everyone else. Even small children know that tigers can maul people, and yet this is not genuine knowledge. It is only genuine knowledge if it is like that of the farmer. Well, why is that so important? Chung-Yi continues, and so there are people who know it is wrong to do something, and yet they still do it. This is not genuine knowledge. If it were genuine knowledge, they definitely would not do it. So Chung-Yi is trying to explain the phenomenon, or at least the apparent phenomenon, of people who know what they should do and they don't do it, or they know what they should not do and they do it anyway. And his solution to the problem is the distinction between genuine knowledge and what he calls common knowledge. And it's interesting, if you ask me what contrasts with genuine knowledge, I guess I'd say false knowledge, fake knowledge. But for whatever reason, Chung-Yi says, no, there's genuine knowledge and then just common knowledge. And the people who know they should do something but don't do it only have common knowledge. The people who know they shouldn't do something and do it anyway, they just have common knowledge. Whereas the person who had genuine knowledge would do the good and would avoid what is evil. They would have the sincerity referred to in the Great Learning. In other words, the person who has genuine knowledge, their love of the good is like loving a lovely sight. Their hatred of evil is like hating a disgusting odor. Now, Zhu Xi, whom I mentioned a few moments ago, he builds this into a diagnosis of how it's possible to know the good yet fail to do it, or hate evil yet do it anyway. This is a problem Western philosophers often refer to as the problem of weakness of will, or using the Greek term akrousia. And Zhu Xi's explanation is that there's a two-stage process in knowing. He says when people know something, but their actions don't accord with it, their knowledge is still shallow. Right? Like the people who say, yeah, I know tigers are dangerous. But once they personally experienced it, their knowledge is more enlightened and does not have the same significance it's had before. Like the farmer who'd been mauled by the tiger and knows that they're really dangerous in a genuine knowledge sense. Zhu Xi says elsewhere, one may already be enlightened, but not be attentive to it. Then one does not fully possess one's own enlightenment, and one lacks the foundation for advancing in virtue. In other words, remember the passage in the Great Learning, it said, if you don't love the good like loving a lovely sight and hate evil, like hating a disgusting smell, you're engaging in self-deception. You're not being attentive to the knowledge you actually have, is how Zhu Xi would put it. So Zhu Xi says there's really a two-step process in ethical knowledge. He says those who desire to cultivate themselves when they know to do good in order to avoid the bad must then genuinely make an effort and forbid self-deception, making their hatred of the evil be like hating a hateful odor, and their loving what is good like they're loving a lovely sight. So, according to Zhu Xi, it's not that everybody loves the good like they love a lovely sight, or hates evil like they hate a disgusting odor. That's an achievement we get by being attentive to the knowledge we have. And to me, this has always struck me, at least as an armchair psychologist and philosopher, as an insightful account. One of the examples I often give is there's a gym in between my office and my home that I pass by on the way back from work. Why don't I spend more time in the gym exercising? I know I'll live longer and live a healthier life if I exercise 2 or 3 times a week. So why don't I do it? I think a lot of it is a kind of self-deception. You know, I manage to think of other things besides the fact I'm passing the gym. I manage to focus my attention on what a long day I've had and how, I really deserve some rest after a long day instead of going to the gym. And Zhu Xi would say, that's how you take your genuine knowledge and you convert it into common knowledge by a lack of attentiveness to it. So we start with this, kind of enigmatic passage. What is meant by making thoughts have sincerity, which is a phrase that Confucius uses in the classic section, is to let there be no self-deception. It's hating evil like hating a hateful odor. It's like loving the good like loving a lovely sight. This is called not being conflicted. So now we understand the passage a bit better, but it leaves us with some questions. For example, is hating evil like hating a hateful, that is gross, smell? And if so, how so? Is loving the good like loving a lovely, that is sexy sight? And if so, how so? Can someone know the good but not do what is good, or know what is bad but do it anyway? There have been people who denied that these are possible. In the Western tradition, there's an interpretation of what Socrates says in works like the Meno, where you never do evil knowing it's evil. You do evil because you take it to be good. And later in the Confucian tradition, Wang Yangming would say, no one ever does what they know is wrong. People always do what they know is good. And apparent counterexamples are due to misuses of terms like knowing, or attributing to people knowledge they don't really have. And finally, can we give some clear examples of the role of self-deception in wrongdoing? How do we render our moral knowledge common knowledge through self-deception? Well, thank you for listening to what I've had to say. As people like to say in Chinese, I respectfully invite your corrections. So what questions or observations do people have? Looks like your hand was going up. Were you?
Oh, I was going to stroke my beard to be more philosophical, but I can ask a question. So you talked about how hating evil like you hate a hateful smell, there's the immediacy of your action, and you don't consider whether or not you ought to drink poor bad smelling milk anyways. Is there not also something to be said there about how evil should be immediately recognizable in the same way that a bad smell is?
Yeah, and that's right. And so this is the excellent. So this is the kind of the key point, that your perception and your motivation should go together. And you find it's interesting because in the later Confucian thinker Wang Yangming says, look, you know what's right and what's wrong. You just need to act on that knowledge. And Wang Yangming is a very inspiring philosopher, but one of the things I often say with my students back at Vassar is, by the time you get to be a student of Wang Yangming's, you've already been socialized and educated very heavily, so you do really know what good and bad are. It's just a matter of getting the motivation to do it. And Wang says, so do it. Jushi is interested in how you get to be a moral person over your entire life. And Jushi lays out this complete philosophy of education. He says there's the xiaoshui, the lesser learning, which is how children are educated in things like basic etiquette and also calligraphy and what we would call phys ed, so archery and charioteering. And so you raise people in the right habits, which actually sounds a lot like one of the key points in Aristotle's theory of ethical cultivation, through habituation in various kinds of arts, but also in ritual, so that you have the right habits already. Then you go on to what he calls the greater learning. And he thought that this text was the basic text of the higher ethical education that teaches you the why behind the what that you learned ethically. So you learn why these things are ethical, that you were taught were ethical as you were habituated as a child. And then at that point, the last step is to make that knowledge efficacious by not lying to yourself about what you know. But then what happened in the Chinese tradition is Jushi's thought became orthodoxy. And there's no worse fate that can befall a really original thinker than having their ideas become orthodoxy. The same thing happened to Thomas Aquinas. So Aquinas had all these revolutionary ideas, and he wanted to encourage people to engage in dialogue and think for himself. And then Aquinas' ideas became orthodoxy. He became Saint Thomas Aquinas. And Jushi became like the guy whose interpretations of the classics was the right interpretation on the civil service exams. So people started to memorize what Jushi said and regurgitate it on the exams instead of thinking about how it applied to their lives. And so in this environment, Wang Yangming, centuries later, comes along and he's like, forget all this complicated stuff Jushi told you, just do it. Just do the right thing. And I don't usually tell stories on students. This was a student many years ago, and so you'd never be able to figure out who it was. But one of my students said, yeah, Wang Yangming just sounds great. I'd love to have a teacher guide me in that way. And I said, okay, so, well, what do you think your main ethical issue is? And he said, well, I tend to procrastinate. And I said, okay, what are you procrastinating about now? He said, well, I've got some math homework I should be doing. And I said, okay, I'll be Wang Yangming. Go do your math homework. And he said, that is such a great point. I mean, that is exactly what I'm talking about, that I never get that kind of direct feedback about what I should be doing. Yeah, so go do your math homework. Yeah, that's it. So I'm procrastinating right now by talking to you. I said, yeah, you are, so stop doing it and go do your math homework. It took me 20 minutes. He never hit him because it's all self-deception. It's like he's identified what his issue is, but he's still wallowing in it because all that's needed is that act of will to focus on it. So, but you're right. I mean, short answer to your insightful question, Jushi thinks there's sometimes more work to do involved in learning what is right and wrong. Wang Yangming isn't focusing on that, I think in part because the students he's dealing with have already been through that. So for them, the issue is just activating the knowledge they've already got. But Jushi says, well, no, you are going to have to learn about these things. So, and it's funny, I see these things even today, like I'll just, some of my colleagues in other courses or even other disciplines will say, we spend all this time teaching students not to be racist and not to be sexist, and not to be classist, and then they go and they do stuff that's racist, sexist, and classist. Like, what did you think we were reading about in those books? And I'm like, this is the situation Wang Yangming was in, where all these students have read all this stuff, and they don't put it into effect. And Wang says it's all a matter of not lying to yourself about what you're doing and being attentive to what you're actually doing. So yeah, great question. Anybody else stroking their beard or their face? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I have a question. So the original great learning quote is to hate a hateful odor and love a lovely sight. Right. So it sounds to me like when you think about your virtue, in a sense, it is natural, right?
Yeah.
You naturally hate the hateful smell and naturally love like the physical beauty, right? But then when it gets to Jushi, it sounds like you have to cultivate it.
Right.
So what's the Jushi stance on this?
Yeah.
He is also, I think, probably the one who built like Sun Tzu Jing, like to say people are born to be good.
Yeah.
So do they conflict each other?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, and the Sun Tzu Jing, the 3-character classic, it's written by people who are influenced by Jushi's ideas.
Yeah.
And as you may know, since you cited it, it becomes one of the primers that's used to teach children their first characters.
Yeah.
And what's the name of the director? Chloe Zhao, as I recall, when she got in her Oscar acceptance speech, she actually cited the Sun Tzu Jing. And so it opens up by Ren Zhi Chu Xing Ban Shan.
Yeah.
So people at their beginnings, their natures are fundamentally good. So this raises really deep kind of issues. So here's what, there's so many complicated things going on, but here's a simple way an overly simplistic way maybe of presenting it. The view that develops with people like Jushi is that your nature is fundamentally good, but the goodness is obscured by your selfish desires. And although it's theoretically possible for anybody to access that good nature, in most of us, the good nature is hidden so much by our selfish desires that we can't see it easily in ourselves. We can see it more easily in the Confucian classics, like the Great Learning. And so they will give us these abstractions of the pattern, the moral pattern, and we can find it more easily in the books. So we can see our faults better by having them diagnosed in the classics, and that helps clarify our own moral understanding so that we can now act on it. Then, but you do get people in the tradition, and Wang Yangming, whom I mentioned earlier, is one of these thinkers. They say, well, look, if we agree that your nature's good, what do I need the classics for? And there's a poetic couplet in which Wang says, the 10,000 sages are passing shadows. It is pure knowing that is my guide. And what does that mean? It means, yeah, Confucius is okay, but the moral guide within me, which has all the moral knowledge, that's my real source of insight, and that's all I need to follow. So there were people who said, if we're serious about this notion that our nature is fundamentally good, all you need to do is exercise that, and you don't need the Confucian classics. I'm more of a Jushi guy most of the time, and I tend to think, yeah, in principle, yeah, it's kind of like one analogy is, would it be possible if, God forbid, civilization were wiped out, could some genius reconstruct all of mathematics and physics? Conceivably, yeah, but that's a real long shot. You know, it's better if you want to learn physics to not try to sit down and come up with it all by yourself, and take a class in physics. And maybe you'll be the next Newton or Einstein, you know, or Marie Curie, and you'll come up with all these new advances. But that'll work better if you first look at what the sages of your field came up with, and then you extend that. That's more of a Jushi way of thinking about ethics. Like, yeah, in principle you could do it yourself. I don't know why you try to do that, because it's probably not gonna work for you. But there were always these people saying, if my nature's good, I don't need the classics. I can just use my innate insight. So yeah, great question.
Oh,
Yeah,
let me
please.
follow on that
Yeah.
one. Just because think of the, where the analogy might seem to break down is what role does sort of conceptuality play or rationality play? Because it seems as though in the metaphor, the problem is that there might be this moment of intervention where you can rationalize why you don't have to go to the gym or whatever. Whereas if it's somehow you've habituated in a more, cultivate virtue ethic model, you would take that out of the equation. And obviously there's other Chinese thought, later Chinese thought that's deeply suspicious of, of the limits of conceptuality. But I don't normally think of that in Confucian tradition. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, my former classmate and friend, Edward Ted Slingerland, who now teaches at the University of British Columbia, he's got some fascinating work he's done on this, and he points out that the notion of non-action, or wu-wei in Chinese, is something we often associate with Taoism. The notion that you might do your best when you act spontaneously. But Ted points out that the expression wu-wei, non-action, actually occurs in the Analects, the sayings of Confucius. And he points out, I think correctly, that the Confucians also recognized, although they don't often use that phrase, they recognized the power of the model of the person who just spontaneously does the right thing without having to think about it. So where at least some Taoists, like the Tao Te Ching attributed to Lao Tzu, would disagree with Confucians, is the Confucians would say, you can consciously cultivate virtues to the point where they're spontaneous and unreflective. Whereas the view you get in the Tao Te Ching is that the effort to cultivate virtues undermines the virtues. And in fairness, there are I think this is a problem when you teach ethics. There are so many people interested in ethics who are such jerks. Because they're so self-righteous and so annoying, and they just give a bad name to ethics. And that's the Taoist insight that, when the good tries to be good, it's evil. When the beautiful tries to be beautiful, it's ugly. And so you kind of see the point. It's like, well, maybe we shouldn't even try to be good if this is the kind of thing it leads to. But the Confucians will acknowledge, they're perfectly aware, there are people who do evil under the guise of good, or there are people who, try to be good and it just makes them worse. but it's like a lot of things in life. There are certain things you can get better at with practice. So if you wanted to say suppose you wanted to be an Olympic class figure skater, no one's born being an Olympic class figure skater. You might be born with good coordination and good muscle strength and things like that, but you're going to have to work a long time to get good at that. No one's born being a really good writer. I mean, you might have a knack for words, but it's really a lot of effort and practice that makes you a really good writer. And so Confucians would focus on examples like that and say, being a good person is like anything else. You know, you may have a certain knack for it, but you're going to have to cultivate that knack to fully develop the virtue. And you can't just rely on uncultivated virtue to be a good person. So it is interesting. You find an overlap between certain Taoist themes and Confucian themes, and I think Ted Slingerland did a good job in pointing that out in some of his work. Oh yeah, I think your hand was next. No, you got your.
Excellent. Thank you very much for coming out to
Sure.
Conway and sharing this research with us. A couple of questions I have. One, I'll start with a more kind of funny question. Back in grad school, we were translating these texts at the University of Hawaii years ago, and one of my upperclassmen, he made a quick jump from to color to sensual beauty to sex.
Okay.
So when I see this, I immediately read this. You know, you should love the good rule, hao like you love good sex. So is that too far of a stretch? You're getting there already. You're approximating it with your physical beauty by way of jushi.
Oh, like actual sex, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if I would go that far. I think the kind of it's funny because su, in fairness, can mean color even in classical Chinese, like in the modern Chinese vernacular, yan, su, color.
Right.
There, I can give it insight. Like, there are examples where su just means color in classical, but it appears that just as color is a perceptual quality, so su refers not to the act of sex, but to finding someone erotically attractive, and the way in which, for example, I'm trying to think of a good, George Clooney maybe. I don't know who contemporary young people think is hot, but maybe that's kind of an old example, but substitute your own example. But like if you just said George Clooney, he's really attractive. Like, oh, so you're attracted to him? Oh, no. Well, it doesn't make any sense. If you think he's really hot, then you're at some level attracted to him. I think that's the insight, that there's a way in which to find someone, to conceptualize them in a certain way is to be drawn to them. To conceptualize something as a disgusting odor is to be repulsed by it. So I don't think it's the act of sex. But it is a kind of erotic attachment, and it's an interesting example because a lot, and this is partially, in fairness, Jushi's fault. Jushi does think that many of he even uses the phrase, run yu, human desires are problematic. And some later Confucians criticized him for that and said, what's so wrong with human desires? We are human beings after all. And in particular, Dai Jun, who's a Qing dynasty, that's the last imperial dynasty, he was in the 18th century. Dai Jun was this 18th century Confucian. He said, all these earlier Confucians like Jushi and Wang Yangming, they didn't recognize that the point of Confucian political theory is to create an environment in which people can satisfy their human desires for food, for shelter, for physical security, even for sex, for loving relationships with other people. These are good natural desires, and that's what we're working for as Confucians. So because though Jushi was worried about the ways in which our physical desires could get in the way of our moral knowledge, I think it actually led some later Confucians to not notice that sa has to mean something like sexual attractiveness here. Because that can't be what this is about. That just seems so base. But at the core of the Confucian tradition is the recognition that we're embodied creatures who have human desires, and we should work so that everybody can satisfy those desires, not just members of the elite.
term biology or biological drive is there in nature for human nature. Showing that
Exactly, yeah.
It goes back to Mencius and that debate with Gautza as well. Human
Exactly.
nature disposed towards good, human nature disposed towards sexuality and eat, drink, man, woman, as they say.
Yeah.
But one more question.
Sure.
Does this go beyond just a moral scope, a kind of limited moral scope as we would conceive of it, say in a Kantian or an Aristotelian moral virtue ethics? I mean, to mean something more like a pragmatic understanding of good, like what is right is what works. So we should be attracted to what is right, in the sense of does it fit, does it work in this grander situation?
Yeah, I think it's a broad notion, and you also mentioned Aristotle. Well, thank you for coming. You also mentioned Aristotle. I would personally distinguish Kant and Aristotle in this respect. And this is a bit of an unfair oversimplification of Kant, but certainly there's a way of reading Kant where morality is this set of side constraints on our behavior over here, and that's a limited part of our life, and then we've got the rest of our life to do what we please as long as we don't violate these side constraints on our action. And I associate the earlier Aristotelian conception of the good as being more similar to the Confucian conception, where living well is about creating a beautiful and satisfying life overall. So one of the most enigmatic lines in the sayings of Confucius is, it says Confucius would not sit unless his mat was straight. And that's sometimes used to parody Confucius as somebody who just cares too much about insignificant details of his environment. But another way you could see it is Confucius saying everything matters. How you dress matters, how you keep your room matters, how you talk to your friends matters. And the Analects, the sayings of Confucius, has some very everyday advice about life, like the proper way to talk to superiors. You should be polite but not fawning. The proper way to talk to people that you supervise. You should be kind but not overly familiar. And so I think it is the case that this Confucian ideal is an ideal of a beautiful and life worth living overall, and not just a narrow Kantian conception of what are the handful of things I absolutely must not do, and then I just do anything I want with the rest of my life.
Very cool.
Was your hand up?
It was not, but
Oh.
I was thinking when your distinction with Kant and Aristotle, I was thinking this, not original with me, but something to the effect with Kant, it's forget about being happy, do what's right.
Yeah.
Whereas with Aristotle, no, what's right is in the end what will bring you that happiness.
Yeah, and I think that's how Confucians think about it too. That, and it's funny because Kant, I often say to my students, you're Kantians whether you know it or not. Because Kant, even if you've never heard the guy's name, he's influenced how you think about emotions, how you think about morality. And there was a book that came out a few decades ago. I didn't think it was a great book, but I thought the title was great. The title was Ethics and Other Liabilities. And the idea was that ethics was, in a certain way, a kind of liability where here's things you gotta do because they're required by morality, but they don't have anything to do with making your life worth living. Isn't that annoying? But that, again, it's a little bit unfair to Kant, who's more nuanced than this, but there's a way Kant encourages you to think about it that way. And the more classic Confucian, there are certainly many differences between Confucian and Aristotelian systems of thought, but I have in common the fact that a good life is a life worth living, where you're better equipped to deal with the problems that have in life because you've made yourself into a particular person. And I think my life is a little better than it would be otherwise because I've studied things like Confucianism and Aristotelianism. I've learned techniques for dealing with adversity, ways to think about things that are constructive, ways to shape my character in good ways. And I've got a long way to go as a human being, but I think it has been a little better because of what I've learned. And not just in a narrowly moral sense, but just, better lived life.
I've got a question from online.
Oh, please, yeah.
David, if you want to go ahead.
Yes, I was just reflecting on what you were saying about the different approach that the Taoists and Confucians take to expressing, learning morality, and how I teach psychology, and there's a debate in our field about whether really ethical action is really more based on cognition, on reflection, and training, and therefore reflective training in a sense, more Confucian, which is kind of in the traditional mode, or is it really based more on effective, feeling-based immediacy of responses? And so that sounds to me like that the Taoists, the way you were portraying it, sort of have a romantic preference for the latter, and the Confucians more the former. And I was thinking of that in terms of, loving what is lovely. Can you be trained to love what is lovely? Or is that romantic notion that, well, we must just be born with that love for what is lovely and good and true? I don't know. I just found that an interesting contrast. I wondered if you had anything else maybe to say about that.
Well, thank you. I think that's a really good insight. I think you are catching part of what divides the Taoists and the Confucians on this issue. I mean, to be really honest, I think my sympathies are more Confucian than Taoist, although I recognize the power of the Taoist critique. I think, partly it's a matter of, think about something like finding someone, and this is a point that Plato makes in the Symposium. When you find someone erotically attractive, a kind of shallow person focuses on shallow aspects of a human being, and they're attracted to superficial or shallow aspects. But as you become deeper, you appreciate the beauty of somebody's soul and the beauty of their mind, and you realize that that is what is really beautiful about somebody, and that's what attracts you to them. And we often use this expression, platonic friends or platonic love. And I think in contemporary dialogue, when we talk about platonic love, we mean a kind of tepid, weak sort of attraction to somebody. But if you read the descriptions of love in dialogues like the Symposium or Plato's Phaedrus, it's clear that platonic love is extremely intense. And for him, it's the most intense kind of love because it's when you love someone's soul. You see what's really deep about them as a person, and that's what you're attracted to. And speaking as, somebody who's had different kinds of relationships in his own life, yeah, when at a certain point in your life, you're attracted to superficial things like, oh, nice hair. But then you grow up and you're like, yes, so what? That's not what's important. You begin to appreciate people as people and the depth of their personality and what motivates them, and you begin to be attracted to deeper aspects of them, and this is the really deep attraction, when you're attracted to somebody's soul and their good character and their virtue and their own passion to know things. So that's just a way of saying that even something like being drawn to someone erotically is something that, although everybody can understand the example at some level, even erotic attraction is something that is partially learned. And it's something that we can get deeper at with a certain kind of philosophical training. So I guess that's why in the long run I end up being more of a Confucian than I am a Taoist.
Are there other questions from people online? Maybe check. I just want to check in with people online if they have. You can raise your hand or you can put the question in the chat. More people here.
I wonder about, maybe the first question that you raised, maybe wonder about any instances of moral ambiguity that are dealt with in these texts. Because it does seem as though, the perception itself, right, sort of triggers something, or is knowledge, which means it ought to be available to be known as such, and then is there any sense of like the deceptiveness of appearances of the good and things like that?
Well, it's interesting. Confucius himself admits that he sometimes misjudges people. So Yan Hui was Confucius's greatest disciple, and it's interesting. He says of Yan Hui, he says, I used to think he was stupid because he never asked any questions. And so I thought he's not thinking because he never asked any questions, but it turns out that he was just so smart that he was immediately understanding everything and then putting it into effect. And interestingly, the reason he realized he understood things was, I looked at how he behaved outside of class and I realized, oh, he gets it. He's actually understanding these things really. And then another disciple, he said, I misjudged him too. I mean, based on what he said, I thought he was a really great disciple. And then, I looked at how he behaved and I realized, nope, he's not a good person. So there is, and it's interesting because the later Confucian tradition, which wants to portray Confucius as a perfect sage, in the commentaries they will say, well, of course Confucius didn't actually make these mistakes. He's just pretending that he made these mistakes so that the rest of us will have something to aspire towards. But I take Confucius at his word. He's like, no, I'm a fallible creature. We all are. Sometimes you make mistakes. Confucians, but in general, they are less fixated than Western philosophers are on what you might call quandary cases where it's really hard to know what to do. One Western philosopher said a lot of Western philosophy has become the casuistry of emergencies, which is a very complicated phrase that just means a lot of contemporary Western philosophy is just obsessed with weird dilemmas. Like suppose you're controlling a trolley and it can run over 3 old people, or what is it, 3 old people, or 1 baby, or where do you choose? And I think a lot of Confucians would say, has that ever happened to you? Is this a problem that really comes up in your life a lot? They're more concerned with things like how do you learn what is right in the first place, and then how do you act on that. They do occasionally discuss interesting dilemmas, and they're very clear also that, and I find this interesting, Aristotle says that, and this is I think, partly a jibe at his teacher Plato. Aristotle says ethics is not mathematics. In ethics you have to use the lesbian ruler. And now what on earth does that mean? Well, a lesbian ruler apparently was a lead ruler they developed on the island of Lesbos that's flexible, so you can measure things that are uneven. And Aristotle's point is ethics isn't like math, it's more like a practical activity where you have to adjust to the complexities of individual situations. Likewise, Confucians will say, they stress the fact that right action has to be very context sensitive. So in the Mengzi text that I translated, a rival philosopher says to Mengzi, and you can just see how this went, even more than 2,000 years later, you can see how it went. The rival philosopher is like, so Mengzi, is it the ritual that men and women are not to touch hands in giving and receiving things? And Mengzi says, yeah, that's the ritual. And the guy says, well, if your sister-in-law were drowning, what would you do then? And Mengzi says, you'd grab her and you'd pull her out. You'd have to be an animal not to save your sister-in-law when she's drowning. And obviously the guy thinks, oh, I got you now. Like, aha, now what are you going to say? And he's like, well, that'd be a different situation. And he says, you just use discretion to realize that in this situation, this is an exception to the rule that you don't, touch your sister, your sister-in-law. Well, now she's drowning. And Mengzi gives a lot of examples in which sages do different things in different situations. But interestingly, he says, "Ed ze jeran," if they exchange places, all would do thus. So if they switch places, they would all do what the sage did. So there's a right answer in the situation, but the right answer is context sensitive. And I find if you get nothing else out of a philosophy course, that's a really interesting thing to think, that just because different things are appropriate in different circumstances doesn't mean that anything goes. It could be that there really is a right thing to do in this situation, and it may require a little thought to see what that is, but that the fact that what's right in this situation isn't what's right in that situation doesn't mean that there's no standards in ethics. A charming example I'd like to use with this is, growing up, my son, I also, when I was a child, I had lots of breathing issues. It's not asthma, it's actually, we're just really prone to croup, which is a kind of, if you're a parent, it's like it sounds like you're dying. You just get a cold, and then all of a sudden it gets into your throat, and you're like, and it's an emergency room visit. And so I had this a lot when I was a kid. My son had it, so we were always taking my son to the emergency room. It's just like, and it was just, I could just prescribe after a while. I'm just like, okay, give him epinephrine, and we're going to get him on an O2 with, make sure it's you've got some water humidified so it's not dry O2. Let's go. And then I just sit with him in the emergency room until morning when he can breathe again, and then we go home. And so he was a little kid when this is happening. He has a twin sister, and at one point the twin sister came to me and said, Melissa said, "Daddy, you always take Charles to the emergency room and you never take me." And I had to explain, well, Charles can't breathe. That's why I'm taking him to the emergency room. I promise you, Melissa, if you ever need to go to the emergency room, I will take you. It's not that I love you less, it's that you need different things from Charles. And so I sometimes use that as like an example of the context sensitivity. It's not that I care any less about Melissa, it's that she could breathe just fine. So, but so this is, it is surprising. It seems like it's maybe an obvious point, but I think people often miss this, that, different situations call for different responses. That in itself isn't being inconsistent. That's being context responsive. And that's part of the point of the virtue of wisdom. That's why you need the virtue of wisdom. Oh, in the back, yes, please.
Is what you're talking about right now related to the concept you were talking about earlier with the tiger thing? When you were talking about the difference between genuine knowledge and what was the other one?
Common knowledge.
Common knowledge. So, for genuine knowledge, the tiger guy learned it because he had obviously he had to.
Yeah.
But is genuine knowledge synonymous with beliefs, personal beliefs, or is that something else?
Right. So I think for these guys. So here's the question. Suppose, let's use my example. Suppose I know that I will live longer and have a healthier life if I go to the gym and work out for at least 20 minutes 2 to 3 times a week. It seems like I know this. I've read enough articles that I know this is true. I don't have any real serious doubts about it. Yet I often don't go to the gym 2 or 3 times a week for at least 20 minutes. Why is that? And so the answer that Wang Yang-ming, this later Confucian thinker, would give is he'd say, well, you don't really know it. If you knew it, you would act on it. But Zhu Xi would say, no, Van Norden knows it, but the knowledge isn't motivating him because he chooses not to focus on that knowledge at the points where it's relevant. So genuine knowledge is like when your understanding of the world matches your motivation. And it's possible to do that as long as you focus on what you are doing. I don't know if this example is too much, but suppose, for example, maybe you've got a crush, or somebody's got a crush on their best friend's significant other, and your best friend goes out of town for something, and the best friend's significant other invites you to their dorm room to study. Should you go over? You probably I probably shouldn't. I mean, whatever they're thinking, maybe they're completely innocent and they just haven't thought about me like that at all, but this is just not a good situation. And so, but in deciding to go over to their dorm room to study with them, at that instant you lie to yourself about what you're doing. You're like, I'm just helping her study. He said, hey, will you look after her while I'm out of town? I'm like, I'm looking after her. He said to, help her. No, I'm not going to help her study. She asked me to study. But you know what you're actually doing here, right? And so, again, as an armchair psychologist, this seems right, that often when I do what I shouldn't do, I decide not to pay attention to what I know. One of the smartest people I ever knew was a colleague who's now retired from Vassar, Jennifer Church, just really brilliant philosopher, also the kind of person you just like immaculately, perfectly dressed and always says the right thing to say. She's on every dimension, just a wonderful person. And we were just chatting one morning and she said, oh, I was up really late last night. I said, oh, why is that? She said, I found this game on my phone that I really like. And when I got to the end of one game, I would really quickly start the next game so I didn't have time to think about how late it was. And she said, I don't know if you've ever done anything like that. And I said, Jennifer, that is my entire life. And I said, that's a perfect example. She's consciously I'm going to start the next game really fast. Why? So she doesn't have time to be attentive to how late it is or to the fact she has to be up early to teach the next day. Zhu Xi says that in a nutshell is how weakness of the will occurs. And I like that because in Aristotle, there's a long discussion in Aristotle, and I'm a fan of Aristotle in a lot of ways, but he's got this long discussion of weakness of the will, basically similar kind of cases. Maybe I'm missing something. I still, after years of reading Aristotle, don't understand his explanation of how weakness of will occurs. He says it's like a drunk person reciting poetry. Like if you're blackout drunk and you're reciting poetry, you don't even know what you're reciting. Like, okay, that sounds right, but how did I get there? And Jushi's like, I'll tell you how you got there. You chose not to focus on your moral knowledge. So you can utter the words, but they're not going to mean anything to you because you've chosen to focus on something else to rationalize your behavior to yourself. And to me, that's like, that sounds right. That sounds like the explanation of what I do when I do things that I shouldn't do.
Yeah, I think that's what Aristotle says.
Maybe that's what he's getting at, but I had always had trouble finding that in Aristotle.
I'm going to steal your example of going over to the friend's significant other, because I thought that was perfect.
I thought so too. I don't always use it because it just seems like too spot on for students. I'm like, am I making people uncomfortable? Is anybody going to be like, oh God, I did that? But yeah, I think it's a perfect example because we can relate to that kind of example.
When Aristotle says we put it under the wrong universal, so this person says, no, this isn't cheating on my friend. It doesn't go into that category.
It's helping
it goes
my
under the
friends.
category of studying together and helping.
I'm helping a classmate
Yeah,
study. I'm a good person.
Yeah, I put it under the wrong heading.
Yeah.
That's how I take Aristotle.
Yeah. So, but I thought anyway. For me, I could only really see that when Jushi put it this way, and that's what he's getting at with. And this is I think a strikingly. I'd say it's at the beginning too. What is meant by making thoughts have sincerity, and this is the character that we render as sincerity. In Chinese, I don't know if that's I don't think it's a great translation. It's become the standard translation, so we use it. Is to let there be no self-deception. And again, it's a very compact phrase, and you see this in lots of traditions. You'll have these very compact, obscure expressions of the classics, and then the commentarial tradition opens them up for you. And sometimes you're not sure if the commentators understand it the way the original text meant it, but still the commentary is really interesting. And Jushi unpacks this as, well, you've got the moral knowledge there, but you've chosen not to be attentive to it. And so you're deceiving yourself in that respect. So I'm just helping my friend study. Or, you know what, I'm just going to start another game, but without thinking about how late it is. That was a decision you made. And if you make it fast enough, you can ignore the moral knowledge that you've got. Yeah, please.
I have one last minor question
Sure.
about the translation of 色. So, do you think that the translations may be in somewhat related to a Buddhist perception of 色? While when we read Heart Sutra, 色即是空，空即是色.
Yeah.
So, do you think they are somewhat connected, or not quite, or what do you think?
Yeah. So I think when I'm sure you know this, but just for the rest of our audience, so Buddhism comes to China from India, and there's a problem of, as they start to translate these Buddhist works into Chinese, there's a problem of what vocabulary to use. And sometimes they translate by just directly taking a Sanskrit word and then they phonetically represent it with a series of characters. I know you know that, but the rest of our audience. But then other times, especially I think over time, as they want to more idiomatically express this in Chinese, they find terms which are partial equivalents and kind of use those. So when they say emptiness is, in this case appearance is emptiness in the Heart Sutra, they're using this term sa, which has both connotations of like color or appearance, but also connotations of things that you're drawn towards in a lustful or acquisitive way, because they think it captures that one of the 5 skandha, or aggregates that is referred to. And as you know, the Heart Sutra goes on to identify according to the early Buddhist tradition, there are 5 kinds of things that exist: material reality, and then 4 different kinds of mental states. And those are called in Sanskrit the 5 skandha, often translated the 5 heaps or the 5 aggregates. And the Heart Sutra makes this really interesting claim, and it says, emptiness, meaning lack of a self, is identical with each of the 5 aggregates or 5 skandha. And so what it means is everything, this world that we live in, is empty of distinct separate selves. So, but the term they want to use for this, for the skandha that would be, I think it's rupa in the original Sanskrit, is they end up, which is something like material form meaning material form, they decide to render it as sa because they think that's got the closest connotations. But when you do that, it does change the concept a little bit as you bring into it. Now, the original Great Learning, again, it's attributed, as you know, to Confucius with a commentary by his immediate disciple, Master Zheng. I think there's no way that's true. Personally, I think it's probably either late Warring States text or maybe even an early Han Dynasty text. But even so, it would be earlier than the arrival of Buddhism. And so it would be the usage of this term would be independent of Buddhism. But later commentators like Zhu Xi and Wang Yangming, these guys are Confucians responding to the Buddhist tradition, and they're very aware of Buddhist uses of these terms. Part of and I think this is why this is important in part of the Confucian objection to Buddhism is, fairly or unfairly, the Confucians accuse the Buddhists of rejecting life and of being abnegating of life. So they say we Confucians are about living in and enjoying this world and making this world a better place. Buddhists are about transcending this world and running away from it. So it really does make sense for a Confucian to say, if you want to know what loving the good is like, it's like being sexually attracted to somebody. And there's nothing wrong with that. Unlike Buddhist monks and nuns who are celibate, we Confucians, sheng sheng, that's all, as you know, a line from the great appendix to the Changes, you know, Confucianism is about life generating life, generating generation, life giving life, sheng sheng. And so, in a way, it makes sense that the Confucians would love a passage that analogizes loving the good to something erotic because of their endorsement of the moderate satisfaction of human desires. But then, as I say, later Confucians in like the 18th century thought that these Confucians still had not gone far enough in that direction, and they should go farther to legitimating human desires. Because you do still find in people like Zhu Xi and Wang Yangming this phrase "run yu" used pejoratively. Human desires, like that's bad. That's what you have to overcome is your run yu. And people in the Qing dynasty like Daijun said, no, you don't have to overcome your human desires. You have to satisfy them in a way that's consistent with compassion and self-respect. But that's not overcoming, that's just guiding your natural desires. So I think you're right, there's kind of an implicit critique of Buddhism here, although the original text isn't doing it. For the Neo-Confucians, they're like, yeah, see, you know, your sexuality is not something you should transcend. It's something that needs to be channeled and guided, but not something that you don't want to be a celibate monk or nun like these like Buddhist types are.
Well, we've run out of time. Let's thank Dr. Van Norden for the discussion.
Thank you, everyone.